Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers by Grant Naylor. Episode 2. Marooned 793 million miles from Earth and desperate to get back to Liverpool, Dave Lister has signed on as a technician third class on the mining ship Red Dwarf. His first time knowingly on a spaceship, Dave has already discovered 3 unpleasant things. The journey home is going to take 5 years and not the 18 months he'd calculated. Technician third class is another name for someone who cleans the gunk out of chicken soup machines. And most unpleasant of all, his bunkmate is Arnold J. Rimmer, the leader of Z Shift, to which Lister has been assigned. But Rimmer has troubles of his own. His opening address to Z Shift is not going as well as he had hoped. Rimmer gripped the podium tightly and surveyed the members of Z Shift. This was a tricky situation. Rebellion, a loss of respect. It had to be stamped on, it had to be crushed. His book on poweramics was quite clear on that. To crush a minor mutiny, you choose the leader, the toughest, the biggest, the strongest, and you humiliate him. And the rest follow like lambs. Without warning, Rimmer wheeled round and pointed.
You! On your feet!
A man with a face like moon rock hauled his 250-pound frame onto its feet. Rimmer climbed down from the podium and slowly, casually strolled over to face him. He looked up at the small black shark eyes, the bald bullet head, the long matted nostril hair. He was a good 18 inches taller than Rimmer, and Rimmer was tall.
What are you chewing?
Tobacco.
Tobacco?
A grin.
Yeah.
Rimmer smiled and nodded, looking around the lecture theatre.
Well, I hope you brought enough along for all of us.
The others laughed, on Rimmer's side.
Well?
No.
Nope, sir.
Victory.
Get rid of it!
The big man chewed thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then suddenly, a long plume of brown sputum plopped onto the polished toe cap of Rimmer's left boot. Rimmer looked at his left boot, then slowly raised his head.
Some people's respect I've won already. I can see with you it's going to take a little longer. Now, get on the floor and give me 50, mister,
said the big man, and a second stream of half-chewed tobacco arrived on Rimmer's right boot. Rimmer rocked back and forth on his heels, nodding his head and still smiling.
Right, okay,
he said pleasantly.
I think that's about everything. Shift, dismiss.
Slowly, Z Shift began to meander out of the lecture theatre.
Oh, by the way,
Rimmer called after the tobacco chewer. As the man half-turned, Rimmer leapt through the air and with a kamikaze scream wrapped his arms and legs round the big man's frame, and they crashed into a row of chairs. As Lister left the theatre, Rimmer was having his head rhythmically beaten against one of the desktops. The huge sound system vibrated and shook as it pumped out a hip-hoppabilly reggae number from a band which had been red-hot for 2 weeks 5 years previously. 2,000 crew members stood on the dance floor, swaying and sweating, while the rest sat around tables, drinking and sweating. Though they'd been aboard less than 2 days, all the lowlifes, ne'er-do-wells and slobs in general had somehow found each other, kindred spirits, and were sitting around in noisy, moronic pockets having drinking competitions. Equally, all the ambitious career types had somehow been sucked together and were drinking low-alcohol white wine or slimline mineral water and talking intensely about work. The music changed. A Johnny Cologne number. Press your lumps against mine. It was smooch time. There was a loud scraping of chairs as people stood up and guided their partners onto the already packed dance floor.
Just press your lumps against mine.
A huge, multi-limbed beast rippled, ebbing and flowing, contracting and expanding to the gentle sway of the music. Lister suddenly found himself alone at the table, the others lost in the undulating, pulsing mass of smooching bodies. He squinted drunkenly around the vast disco. So many people. People dancing. People touching. People laughing. People talking. People kissing. So many people. In just over 7 months, every one of them would be dead.
5 months later, Lister stared out of the sleeping quarters viewport window and saw nothing. Just a few very distant stars and an awful lot of black. It was pretty much the same view he'd had for the past 21 weeks. At first he'd found it awe-inspiring. Then slowly, that had given way to just plain dull. Then very dull. Then deeply dull. He looked at his watch. 1950 ship time. He was waiting for Peterson to show up, and they were going down to the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar to spend the evening in the exact same way they'd spent 133 of the last 147 evenings, drinking hugely elaborate San Francisco earthquakes from plastic coconuts and failing to meet any interesting women. Or, more to the point, any interesting women who were interested in them. Dull and gruesomely monotonous as his social life was, Lister knew for a fact that it was at least 474 times more interesting than his working life on Z shift under Rimmer.
Rimmer was sitting at his slanting architect's desk under the pink glow of his study lamp with a tray of watercolors, making out a revision timetable in preparation for his astro-navigation exam. In all, he'd taken the exam 12 times. But he persevered. Rimmer wanted to become an officer. He ached for it. He yearned for it. It wasn't the most important thing in his life. It was his life. Given the opportunity, he would gladly have had his eyes scooped out if it meant he could become an officer. But he had to do something much more demanding, much more impossible, and much more unpleasant. He had to pass the astro-navigation exam.
Born on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, 31 years earlier, he was the youngest of 4 brothers. "My boys," his mother would say. "My clever, clever boys. Johnny the captain, Frankie the first officer, Howie the test pilot, and Arnold. Arnold the chicken soup machine cleaner. If you could sue sperm, I'd sue the sperm that made you." "I'll do it, Mother. One day I will become an officer." "And on that day, Satan will be going to work in a snowplow." 3 times he'd failed the entrance exam to the academy. And so one night, after reading the life story of Horatio Nelson, he'd signed up with a merchant vessel as a lowly 3rd technician, with the object of quickly working his way through the ranks and sitting the astro-navigation exam independently, and thereby earning his commission, the glimmering gold bar of officerhood. That had been 6 years ago. 6 long years on Red Dwarf, during which he'd leapt from being a lowly 3rd technician to being a lowly 1st technician. In the meantime, his brothers went forever onward, up the ziggurat of command. Their success filled him with such bitterness, such bile, that even a Christmas card from one of them, just the reminder that they were alive and successful, would reduce him to tears of jealousy. And now he sat there, under the pink glow of his student's table lamp, preparing to sit the astro-navigation exam for the 13th time. He found the process of revising so gruelingly unpleasant, so galling, so noxious, that like most people faced with tasks they find hateful, he devised more and more elaborate ways of not doing it in a doing-it kind of way. In fact, it was now possible for Rimmer to revise solidly for 3 months and not learn anything at all. The first week of study, he would always devote to the construction of a revision timetable. Every hour of every day was subdivided into different study periods, each labelled in his lovely, tiny copperplate hand, then painted over in watercolours, a different colour for each subject, the colours gradually becoming bolder and more urgent shades as the exam time approached. The only problem was this. Because the timetables often took 7 or 8 weeks to complete,
By the time Rimmer had finished them, the exam was almost on him. He'd then have to cram 3 months of astronavigation revision into a single week. Gripped by an almost deranging panic, he'd then decide to sacrifice the first 2 days of that final week to the making of another timetable. This time for someone who had to pack 3 months of revision into 5 days. Because 5 days now had to accommodate 3 months' work, the first thing that had to go was sleep. To prepare for an unrelenting 24-hour-a-day sleep-free schedule, Rimmer would spend the whole of the first remaining day in bed, to be extra ultra-fresh, so he would be able to squeeze 3 whole months of revision into 4 short days. At this point he would start smoking. A lifelong non-smoker, he'd become a 40-a-day man. He'd spend the whole day pacing up and down his room, smoking 3 or 4 cigarettes at a time, stopping occasionally to stare at the titles in his bookcase, not knowing which one to read first, and popping twice the recommended dosage of dog-worming tablets, which erroneously he believed to contain amphetamine. Realizing he was getting nowhere, he tried to get rid of his soul-bending tension by treating himself to an evening in one of Red Dwarf's quieter bars. 2 small beers and 3 hours of stomach-knotting relaxation later, he would go back to his bunk and spend half the night awake, praying to a god he didn't believe in for a miracle that couldn't happen. Ravaged by the combination of anxiety, nicotine, alcohol he wasn't used to, dog-worming pills, and overall exhaustion, he would sleep in till mid-afternoon. After a long scream, he would rationalize that the day was a total write-off, and the rest of the afternoon would be spent shopping for the 3 best alarm clocks money could buy. This would often take 5 or 6 hours, and he would arrive back at his sleeping quarters, exhausted, but knowing he was fully prepared for his final day's revision before his exam. Waking at 4:30 in the morning, exercising, showering and breakfasting, he would then sit down to prepare a final revision timetable which would condense 3 months of revision into 12 short hours. This done, he would give up and go back to bed. Maybe he didn't know a single thing about astronavigation, but at least he'd be fresh for the exam the next day. Which is why Rimmer failed exams. Well, this time it was going to be different, he thought, as he sat carefully colouring all the quantum mechanics revision periods in diagonal lines of Prussian blue on a yellow ochre background, while Lister stared out of the viewport window. Peterson clumped noisily into the room, and he and Lister went down to the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar for the 134th time. Only this time, Lister did something incredibly stupid. He fell in love. Hopelessly and helplessly in love. Third Console Officer Christine Kachansky had a face. That was the first thing Lister noticed about her. It wasn't a beautiful face, but it was a nice face. It wasn't a face that could launch 1,000 ships, maybe 2 ships and a small yacht. That was until she smiled. When she smiled, her eyes lit up like a pinball machine when you win a bonus game. And she smiled a lot. They were both standing at the bar, queuing to get a drink, and Lister was looking at her in a not-looking-at-her kind of way. In the bar mirror, in the reflection in his beer glass, over his shoulder, pretending to look at Peterson, at the ceiling just above her head, and occasionally, because it was permitted, directly at her. She got her drinks and went back to her seat, while Lister was still trying to think of something to say which would start a conversation. She got up to go to the bar. Lister got up too. They exchanged smiles, ordered drinks, and went back to their separate tables. Damn! Smeg! Blew it! She got up again.
My round,
said Peterson, rising. Lister thrust him back in his chair and went to the bar. They exchanged smiles and highs this time, ordered their drinks, and went back to their separate tables. Damn! Smeg! Blew it again! She'd hardly sat down before she was getting up again. The 2 girls' glasses were full. She's going for peanuts, thought Lister. You want some peanuts? He asked Peterson.
No thanks.
I'll go and get some. They stood at the bar again. They exchanged smiles again. Then she introduced herself and asked him out for a date. And so it began. Lister became a walking cliché. His senses were heightened, so even the foul, recycled air of the ship tasted crisp and spring-like. He stopped drinking. Pop lyrics started to mean something to him. He started to marvel at the view out of the viewport window. Christine Kochanski was madly, electrically in love with him. Lister's all-time favourite movie was Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, and just to make things totally perfect, it happened to be Kochanski's too. They sat in bed eating hot dogs doused in mustard and watching, for the third consecutive night, It's a Wonderful Life on Kochanski's sleeping quarters vidscreen. And as they lay in the crumb-laden sheets, wrapped in each other's arms, giggling like idiots, and even though they'd only been dating for 3.5 short weeks, Lister knew more certainly than he'd ever known anything in his life before that they'd be together forever. 7 months out into space, while Rimmer sat at his slanting architect's desk under the pink glow of his study lamp, Lister stared out of the sleeping quarters viewport window, longing to be bored again. He'd been not going out with Kochanski now for 3 weeks. The whole affair, the glorious forever he'd imagined, had lasted just over a month. Then, one evening in her sleeping quarters, she told him she wanted to break it off. He'd laughed. He thought it was a joke. But it wasn't. She'd been seeing Tom, a flight navigation officer, for almost 2 years. Tom had left her for a fling with some brunette in catering, and Lister had been a rebound thing. She hadn't realized it at first, but when Tom, Tony, or Terry, or whatever the smeggy was called, had turned up at her door, having dumped the brunette in catering, she'd gone scurrying back. And that was that. Except it wasn't. Because now she was everywhere. Everything he did without her. When he went shopping, he didn't go shopping. He went shopping without Kochanski. When he went to the bar, he didn't go to the bar. He went to the bar without Kochanski. So he lay on his bunk, staring out of the viewport window, longing for the anesthetic of the stupefying monotony which he used to feel 2 short months earlier. He sighed like a senile dog and looked down at Rimmer, hard at work. "Do you fancy going for a drink?" "No." "That's a surprise." "As it happens, I am going out tonight. Just not with you." "What about your revision?" Rimmer had decided to change. His latest 3-month revision timetable had been constructed within 2 hours, and 4 hours a day, come what may, he read his course books, made notes, and revised in a sensible way. And revising in a sensible way obviously meant an adequate provision for leisure time. "Well, where are you going then?" "Out." "Where?" Rimmer ignored him. He was going to spend the evening not getting any older. He was going to spend it in a stasis booth. Red Dwarf, like most of the older ships, was equipped with stasis booths for interstellar travel. 100 years earlier, travelling to other star systems had been considered economically and philosophically interesting, but not anymore. To travel the vast distances involved, even with craft which could achieve demi-light speed, took decades. Necessity being the mother of invention, the stasis booth was duly invented. Basically, it was a foolproof form of suspended animation. But instead of freezing the body cryogenically, the stasis booth simply froze time. In the same way X-rays can't penetrate lead, time couldn't penetrate a stasis field. An object caught within the field became a non-event mass with a quantum probability of 0. In other words, the object remained in exactly the same state, at exactly the same age, until it was released. For a period, ships full of astros in stasis booths were hurled out of our solar system, and interstellar travel enjoyed its golden age. The big hope, of course, was that they'd contact intelligent life. They didn't.
Not even a moderately intelligent plant. Not even a stupid plant. Nothing. In all of the universe, the planet Earth was the only planet with any life forms. That's all there was. Interstellar travel was abandoned as a total waste of time.
Rimmer had a key card to one of Red Dwarf's stasis booths, which he used whenever he could. It made great good sense to Rimmer. In just 5 years he'd saved 369 full days, over a full Earth year. In 5 years he'd only lived for 4. Although his birth certificate said he was 31, technically he was still only 30. Occasionally Rimmer reflected that his boothing could possibly be the reason why he didn't have any friends, but as he pointed out to himself, if he could maintain this routine, by the time his birth certificate said he was 90, he'd actually only be a very sprightly 78-year-old. Pretty a-smegging mazing, eh? Lister slumped off to try and persuade Peterson to go for a drink. Rimmer watched him go, then showered and changed, treated himself to a little aftershave, and went off to spend the very last evening of his life not existing. Next day, on the very last morning of his life, Rimmer strode into the lecture theatre to give Z-Shift their work schedule for the day.
"Okay, men,"
he said as always.
"Listen up. Today's schedule. Turner, Wilkinson, we've had a number of reports that machine 15455 is dispensing black currant juice instead of chicken soup. Saxon and Burroughs continue painting the engineer's mess, and I want that finished today. Also, there's an unconfirmed rumour that the cigar machine in the officers' club is nearly empty. Now, it may be nothing, but just in case, for pity's sake, stay by a phone."
A paper dart whistled past his head.
"Okay, roll out. Lister, you're with me today."
The men began to shuffle out.
"Why me?"
Lister moaned.
"Because it's your turn."
2 of the 3 worst things that ever happened to Rimmer on this day.
The worst thing that ever happened was, of course, his death. But that was a clear 12 hours away. The second worst thing that ever happened had happened 13 months earlier, and was so horrible his subconscious had created a new sub-department to hide it from his waking thoughts. The third worst thing that ever happened to Rimmer happened shortly after 10 o'clock, as he and Lister made their way towards Corridor 1 to check that there was enough shower gel in the women's washroom. First Technician Petrovich rounded the corner.
"What the smeg is wrong with your bleepers? I've been trying to get hold of you for an hour. Lister, the captain wants to see you."
Rimmer looked dumbfounded. Why should the captain want to see Lister? Unless, thought Rimmer, brightening, he's in very, very deep smegola indeed. Lister dragged himself off towards the express lift. "Oh dear," said Rimmer breezily. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." Petrovich made to follow Lister, but then stopped and turned.
"What are you doing with Lister anyway? It's 10:05.
"So?"
"I thought you were taking the astronavigation exam."
"That's November the 27th, you square-jawed chump."
"No, it's October the 27th.
"I think, Petrovich, I know when my own exam is, thank you so very, very much."
My bunkmate is taking it today. He went up at 10.
Rimmer's smile remained exactly where it was, while the rest of his face sagged like a bloodhound's. He looked at his watch. 10:07. He tapped it a couple of times and walked off without saying anything. Rimmer arrived, breathless, back at the sleeping quarters. He skidded to a halt in front of his timetable. His eyes scanned the chart for an error. He couldn't find one. He couldn't find one for a whole 2 minutes. Then he froze. In his haste not to dwell on the construction of the chart, somehow he'd included 2 Septembers. August, September, September, October, November, ran the new Romarian calendar. He looked at his watch. 10:35. He'd missed 35 minutes of a 3-hour exam. A strange calmness overtook him. Well, he could still get to the exam by, say, 10:45. If he kept his answer short and pertinent, it was still more than possible to pass. So far, so good. What was slightly trickier was cramming a whole month's revision into minus 35 minutes. 35 minutes was hard enough, but minus 35 minutes, well... The seconds ticked away. Then it came to him. He knew exactly what he must do. Cheat. Rimmer took out a black felt tip pen, stripped off his shirt and trousers, and began work. He had, he estimated, 20 minutes to copy as much of his textbooks onto his body as humanly possible.
Red Dwarf, Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, was written by Grant Naylor and performed by Chris Barry. Additional music and effects were by Nick Graham. Technical presentation by John Etchells. Produced by Chris Wallace.